In the heart of the countryside, where time seemed to move to the slow rhythm of the seasons and silence was a constant melody, stood Blackwood Farm. It was not a place of great wealth, but of profound peace and rustic beauty that few knew. There, in 1973, the Miller family lived their simple, down-to-earth existence, a private refuge away from the hustle and bustle of the world. John the father was a man of few words but a solid presence, with hands calloused from working in the cornfields that stretched to the horizon, golden under the summer sun. Sarah, his wife, was the soul of the house, with a welcoming smile and infinite patience for her three children. Thomas, the oldest, at 15 years old, already showed a dreamy look, reading adventure books and imagining worlds beyond the farm fences. Life on the Blackwood farm was an almost ritualistic routine. The roosters crowing at dawn, the smell of fresh coffee and homemade bread in the morning, the sound of John's tractor cutting the earth, Emily and Daniel's games in the vast backyard, and the nights under a starry sky where the silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant croaking of frogs. They were a unit, a small, isolated universe, but complete in its simplicity. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was nearly a 2-hour drive away, and the closest neighbors, the Petersons, lived a considerable distance away, making visits rare, usually motivated by some need to exchange supplies or for occasional celebrations. It was a time when communication was not instantaneous, and the absence of news did not always mean something bad. Often it just meant that life continued on its peaceful course, without interruption. But it was precisely this tranquility that suddenly became disturbing, like a dissonant note in a perfect melody. The first to notice that something was wrong was Senra Peterson. That Tuesday, the dairy truck, which passed by the dirt road once a week, returned with the bottles of milk in the miller's delivery box. Strange, Mrs. Peterson thought, frowning. Sarah never forgets the milk. She is so organized. She tried calling the farm, but the landline with its noisy, unstable line only produced a hollow silence, punctuated by static. A fault in the line, perhaps. Senra Peterson wasn't immediately concerned. Life in the country had its setbacks and telephone lines were notoriously fickle. The next day, the miller's absence became more palpable, harder to ignore. Thomas, who usually went into town once a week to get supplies and some books from the small local library, did not show up. The senior Henderson, owner of the general store in Harmony Creek, waited until late afternoon, but the boy did not come. He had known Thomas since he was little and knew that the boy was punctual, almost methodical in his trips to the city. A small pang of worry began to form in Mr. Henderson's chest. In the late afternoon, the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple over the Blackwood farm, but the lights in the Miller house did not come on. Darkness engulfed the property, and an unusual, heavy, and absolute silence hung over the fields. There was no dog barking, no distant sound of a tractor, no Emily's crystal-clear laugh or Daniel's murmur. Only the wind, whispering among the dry corn leaves, seemed to carry a message of emptiness, of something that shouldn't be there. Mrs. Peterson, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night breeze, called the farm again, the same persistent silence. She tried Mr. Henderson, who confirmed Thomas's absence and the growing apprehension in the small town. The worry was now a lump in the throat, a feeling that something serious had happened. The next day, Thursday, Mr. Peterson decided it was time to go to the Blackwood farm. He got into his old truck, the engine revving and sputtering, and drove down the rutted dirt road, his heart pounding a little faster with every passing meter. As he approached the property, the first thing he noticed was the front door of the house ajar, swaying gently in the wind, as if someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to close it. John's car was in the garage, which was unusual since he used it to go into town. A dark foreboding began to settle in, heavy as morning mist. He called John, Sarah, Thomas, Emily, Daniel. His voice, usually strong and resonant, sounded weak and desperate, echoing across the empty courtyard. No response. He entered the house, the creak of the boards beneath his feet, the only sound amplified by the oppressive silence. The kitchen table was set for breakfast with plates and cups, as if the family had gotten up and suddenly simply vanished into thin air. There was a half-finished bowl of cereal on Daniel's desk and an open book of Thomas's in the living room. marking the page of an adventure that would never be completed. Nothing appeared out of place. No chairs knocked over, no signs of a fight or struggle, just absence. An absence that screamed louder than any sound, stronger than any presence. Mr. Peterson checked the barn, the chicken coop, the cornfields that seemed to hold secrets in their tall stalks. Nothing. The Miller family had disappeared without a trace, without a note, without a goodbye. Blackwood Farm, once a haven of peace and life, was now a monument to the unexplainable, an echo of lives that had faded into the rarefied air of the countryside, leaving behind only questions and a haunting emptiness. The mystery had only just begun to weave its web. Mr. Peterson, his heart heavy and his mind in turmoil, ran back to Harmony Creek. News of the Millers' disappearance spread like wildfire, filling the small community with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Sheriff Brody, a burly man with a gray mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much, was the first to arrive at the Blackwood Farm. He knew the Millers, as he knew almost everyone in the area. The scene in the house was disconcerting. The breakfast table was cleared, the beds were unmade, Daniel's toys were scattered across the living room floor, as if life had been abruptly paused, not ended. There were no signs of a break-in, a struggle, or anything that would indicate a forced departure. It was as if the family had simply evaporated. The initial investigation was frantic but fruitless. Sniffer dogs were brought in from neighboring towns, searching every inch of the property, from the cornfields to the dense woods that bordered the farm. Volunteers from Harmony Creek and surrounding rural communities joined the search, forming sweep lines that spanned miles of rugged terrain. The initial hope of finding them lost or injured soon gave way to growing anguish. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Every potential clue led to a dead end. A distant neighbor swore he saw a dark pickup truck on the main road the night of the disappearance, but the description was vague and never led to anything concrete. The only thing that seemed to be missing from the farm, besides his family, was Thomas's diary, a leather-bound notebook that he carried everywhere, where he wrote down his thoughts and observations about the world. It was a small detail, almost insignificant in the face of the magnitude of the mystery, but for Sheriff Brody it was an anomaly in a scenario of disturbing perfection, because only the diary, the absence of any evidence of violent crime, was what most intrigued and frustrated the authorities. There was no blood, there were no unknown tire tracks, there were no stolen valuables. The farm was intact except for the absence of its inhabitants. The refrigerator was full of food, clothes were in the closets, the farm animals, chickens and pigs, were hungry and disoriented, but alive. It was as if the Millers had gone for a brief walk and never returned. The theory that they had fled voluntarily was quickly dismissed. John and Sarah were stable people, with deep roots in the community and no history of financial or personal problems that would justify such an abrupt and unannounced departure. What about the children? No one would believe that they would take Thomas, Emily, and Daniel into a life of uncertainty without even a suitcase. Blackwood Farm, once a symbol of life and hard work, has become a silent monument to the unexplainable. The dusty windows look like empty eyes watching the fields that, without John's care, had begun to be swallowed up by wild vegetation. The tire swing in the backyard, once a stage for Emily's laughter, now creaked lonely in the wind, a melancholy reminder of the joy that had once been there. The small, close-knit community of Harmony Creek felt the weight of the tragedy deeply. Fear set in, whispers of ancient curses and supernatural forces began to circulate, especially among the elders. Children were forbidden from playing near the road leading to the farm, and adults avoided even looking in their direction as they passed. The Miller mystery was not just a police case, it was an open wound in the soul of the city, a constant reminder of the fragility of existence and the capacity of the unknown to invade everyday life. Over time, active search decreased. The outside detectives, who had arrived with the promise of new insights, eventually left, taking with them only their notes and Sheriff Brody's same puzzlement. The Miller case was filed as an unsolved disappearance, one of many that haunt police records. The farm was eventually sold at auction, but no one dared to live there for long. Each new owner, one after the other, reported a feeling of discomfort, of an invisible presence, of a silence that was not natural, but rather charged with an untold story. Time passed and the dust of indifference began to cover the memories, but the mystery of the Miller family remained, a lingering shadow over Harmony Creek, a riddle that seemed destined never to be solved. Thomas's diary, the only object that seemed to have disappeared with them, became an obsession for Sheriff Brody, a detail he could never quite fit into the puzzle. He knew deep down that the key to what happened at Blackwood Farm lay in that little notebook, and that one day, the truth, however macabre, would come out. And it would come in a way that no one could have foreseen. 22 years later, 2 decades have dragged on, and Blackwood Farm remains a scar on the landscape, a silent reminder of the unexplainable. Sheriff Brody, now with white hair and a body bent over with the weight of years and unsolved cases, had retired, but the mystery of the Millers never left him. It was the stain on his career, the unanswered question that haunted him at night insisted. The farm changed hands several times, each new owner trying unsuccessfully to erase the shadow that hung over the land. Until 1995, when a young couple from the city, unaware of the local legends and motivated by the promise of a ridiculous price, bought the property with the intention of transforming it into a modern rural retreat. They saw potential where others saw only ghosts. The renovation began with the barn, an old and imposing structure that had withstood the test of time, but was now in urgent need of repair. While demolishing a false wall hidden behind piles of old hay and rotting boards, workers found a secret compartment. It wasn't big, just enough to house something. And what they found there, wrapped in a worn sackcloth, made the blood run cold in the veins of even the most hardened. There were 5 small, fragile skeletons, arranged almost reverently, as if they had been carefully laid down for an eternal sleep. Next to the smaller one was a small, faded teddy bear, and next to the larger one was a leather-bound notebook, moldy and swollen from the humidity, but unmistakable. Thomas's diary. The news spread like lightning across Harmony Creek, resurrecting the dormant nightmare. Sheriff Brody, upon hearing of the discovery, felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew. He always knew the truth was there, at Blackwood Farm. Authorities were called and the scene became a frenzy of forensic experts and investigators. The identification was quick and painful. The remains were in fact those of the Miller family: John, Sarah, Thomas, Emily, and little Daniel. The cause of death determined after thorough examination was asphyxiation. But what led them to this end, and why were they hiding like that? The answer lay in the damp, nearly illegible pages of Thomas's diary. With shaking hands, Sheriff Brody, now a civilian but still a lawman at heart, flipped through the pages of the journal. Thomas's handwriting, once youthful and dreamy, became increasingly desperate and erratic as the dates progressed. The last few entries were a terrifying account of a growing fear, of an unseen presence manifesting itself on the farm. Thomas described whispers in the wind, shadows moving in the corners of his eyes, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. He spoke of Sarah, his mother, who began to have vivid nightmares and withdraw into herself, and of John, his father, who became increasingly silent and distant, with a look of terror in his eyes. The children, Emily and Daniel, also felt the presence, with Daniel describing invisible friends visiting him in the barn. The last entry, dated the day of the disappearance, was a silent cry of despair. Thomas described the family gathering in the barn, seeking refuge from something in the house, something they couldn't see but could feel. He wrote about their plan to hide in a secret compartment that John had built years earlier, a refuge in times of crisis. The idea was to wait for it to go away. The last, almost illegible sentence was a lament. "We are here. We are safe, but we cannot breathe. We can't." The revelation was a punch in the gut. The Miller family had not disappeared. They had hidden from something that terrified them, to the point that they sought refuge in a space so confined that it led to their death by asphyxiation. What was that? The diary gave no answers, only terrifying intimations of an evil, invisible presence that had invaded their home and their minds. The gruesome, terrifying truth was not about a killer or a kidnapper, but about a fear so deep and paralyzing that it drove an entire family to suffocate in their own hiding place. Blackwood Farm was not haunted by ghosts, but by the memory of an indescribable dread, of a silent agony that lasted until the last breath. The mystery was not who took them, but what forced them into hiding, what made them so afraid that they chose death rather than face the unknown. And as the sun set over the farm, bathing it in hues of red and orange, the silence that followed the revelation was heavier than ever, laden with the echo of a terror that for 2 decades had lain buried, waiting to be unearthed and haunt all who dared to hear its story. Blackwood Farm was now not just a place of disappearance, but a mass grave of a fear that defied comprehension, a grim testament that some truths are more terrifying than any lie. The revelation of the skeletons in the barn at Blackwood Farm and the contents of Thomas's journal hit Harmony Creek like a bolt from the blue, but not a bolt of clarity, but of even deeper darkness. The commotion was immense. The initial shock gave way to a wave of horror and, for many, overwhelming guilt. For 22 years, the community had speculated, mourned, and even forgotten to some extent about the Millers' fate. Now the truth, terrible as it was there, and it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. They had not been taken by strangers, nor had they fled to a new life. They had died just meters from their own home in a desperate act of self-protection against an invisible enemy. Sheriff Brody, who had insisted on the diary's importance for decades, felt a bitter validation. His intuition was correct. The key was in that notebook. But the satisfaction of having his persistence justified was quickly swallowed up by the pain of knowing how close the family had been to being found and how tragic their end had been. He reread the last pages of Thomas's diary over and over again, searching for any detail, any clue that might unlock the nature of the thing that had terrorized the Millers. But the diary was vague, filled with the language of raw fear, not factual description. Whispers, shadows, presence, watching eyes. They were the words of a frightened child, echoing the terror of his parents. The community was divided. Some, the more skeptical, tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was mass hysteria, a shared delirium induced by the isolation and stress of rural life. Perhaps a toxic gas, an unknown leak, had affected their minds, leading them to believe in non-existent threats. But that explanation didn't fit with Thomas's description of a moving presence, watching them, forcing them into hiding. Others, the more superstitious, saw confirmation of their beliefs in ancient curses and evil spirits that inhabited the land. Blackwood Farm, with its history of tragedy, now seemed like a cursed place, a portal to something that did not belong in the world of the living. The truth, however, was that no one knew. And this uncertainty was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the whole story. What could be so frightening, so omnipresent, that it would lead an entire family, a strong father, a loving mother, and 3 children to seek refuge in such a small and suffocating space, preferring slow death, the confrontation with the unknown? What was this thing that left no physical traces, but left indelible marks on the psyche of its victims? The absence of a logical explanation, of a tangible culprit, left a disturbing void. There was no monster to hunt, no criminal to arrest, no disease to cure. There was just pure, utter fear that manifested itself in such a devastating way. Blackwood Farm has once again been put up for sale, but this time there were no buyers. The ridiculous price was no longer an attraction. The macabre story had taken deep root in the land and in the minds of the people. The windows of the main house, previously empty, now seemed to stare out at the world with an expression of silent horror. The barn, where the truth was unearthed, became a place of morbid pilgrimage for the curious, but no one dared to enter. The property has become a sanctuary for the unexplained, a reminder that there are forces in the world that defy human understanding, that operate beyond the limits of logic and science. The Millers' legacy was not just the story of their disappearance and discovery, but the story of fear, the fear that consumed them, the fear that led to their deaths, and the fear that now haunted Harmony Creek. The nights in the small town seemed darker, the most sinister whispers of the wind. People looked at the shadows more closely, and the silence, once a comfort, now carried an oppressive weight. The Miller family story was not just an unsolved case. It was a parable about the fragility of security, about the encroachment of the unknown into everyday life, and about the terrifying possibility that the greatest enemy was not something that could be seen or touched, but something that nestled in the mind, feeding on dread. And as the sun set over the Blackwood farm, bathing it in hues of red and orange, the silence that followed the revelation was heavier than ever, heavy with the echo of a terror that for 2 decades had lain buried, waiting to be unearthed and haunt all who dared to hear its story. Blackwood Farm was now not just a place of disappearance, but a mass grave of a fear that defied comprehension, a grim testament that some truths are more terrifying than any lie. What happened at Blackwood Farm was not just a tragedy, it was a warning, a whisper of the abyss that lurks at the edges of reality, ready to consume those who dare look into it. And the question, what was that? It would continue to echo unanswered through the generations. Time, relentless in its advance, continued to shape the landscape and memory of Harmony Creek. Blackwood Farm over the years has become a place of whispered legends, a grim reference point for ghost stories told around campfires. The fences fell, the main house collapsed in ruins, and the barn, where the macabre truth was revealed, was slowly swallowed by vegetation, as if the earth itself wanted to erase the scars of an unspeakable horror. But the Miller story and the mystery surrounding it never completely disappeared. She became part of the fabric of the community, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the existence of forces that defy human understanding. Sheriff Broad, who lived long enough to see the farm turn to dust, took the unanswered question with him to his grave. What or who had terrorized the Miller family to such a desperate end? He spent his later years revisiting Thomas's diary, searching for a detail that might have escaped him, a word, a phrase that might shed light on the nature of the presence Thomas described. But the diary in its terrifying simplicity offered only the echo of fear, not its cause. The absence of a logical explanation of a tangible culprit was what made the Miller case so disturbing, so frighteningly real. There was no monster to hunt, no criminal to arrest, no disease to cure. There was just pure, utter fear that manifested itself in such a devastating way. The younger generations of Harmony Creek grew up hearing the Miller story, not as a fairy tale, but as a silent warning. They learned to look at the shadows more carefully, to listen to the whispers of the wind with a certain trepidation, and to value the security of their homes in a way their ancestors might not have. Blackwood Farm, now a tangle of ruins and overgrown weeds, was a sanctuary for the unexplained, a reminder that there are forces in the world that defy human understanding, that operate beyond the limits of logic and science. The Miller family story was not just an unsolved case. It was a parable about the fragility of security, about the intrusion of the unknown into everyday life, and about the terrifying possibility that the greatest enemy was not something that could be seen or touched, but something that nestled in the mind, feeding on dread. And as the sun set over what was once the Blackwood Farm, bathing the ruins in shades of red and orange, the silence that hung over the place was heavier than ever, loaded with the echo of a terror that for decades had lain buried, waiting to be unearthed and haunt all who dared to hear its story. What happened at Blackwood Farm was not just a tragedy, it was a warning, a whisper of the abyss that lurks at the edges of reality, ready to consume those who dare look into it. And the question, what was that, would continue to echo unanswered through the generations, a dark reminder that some truths are more terrifying than any lie, and that the greatest fear sometimes lies in that which we can never understand.